lot of people will tell you that movies these days have too much CGI. Usually this is framed as championing practical effects. The problem with Hollywood these days is that soulless computer imagery has replaced hearty, organic special effects from the good old days. But practical effects never actually went anywhere. Film promotions have been touting how their movies mark a triumphant return to the lost art of practical miniatures or real-life car stunts since CGI first became a thing. The miniature industry may have downsized. I'd highly recommend the documentary Sense of Scale for a more detailed look at that, and the ability to augment things in post may have changed the way certain stunts are carried out, in most cases making them safer, but practical effects are and always have been a major part of filmmaking. A lot of other people have lamented that digital movie cameras have replaced the rich, organic look of real film and resulted in a media landscape where all cinematography is dull, washed out, and samey. I think that CGI is great. It's a fantastic tool that makes stunt work safer, logistics simpler, and a lot of things cheaper, while also allowing filmmakers to realize visuals that would be impossible otherwise. Most people who claim that CGI always looks fake have unknowingly watched thousands of VFX shots thinking they were fully practical. I think digital cameras are fantastic, and in the right hands, the resulting product is indistinguishable from film. I think that digital filmmaking tools are wonderful and have been put to use by skilled artists to create beautiful art, and the idea that they are soulless or somehow intrinsically inferior to their analog counterparts is silly, nostalgia-fueled tripe. But I also kinda think they're ruining movies. Let me explain. In James Cameron's Terminator 2, the T-1000's liquid metal morphing powers are realized through a combination of groundbreaking CGI produced by ILM and a coordinated dance of prosthetic appliances, life-cast dummies, complex animatronics, and spring-loaded blade gags produced by Stan Winston Studio. There's also a lot of match cuts, whip pans, and Texas switches that lighten the load on both effects teams. What's interesting comparing this movie to modern counterparts is that despite being an effects-driven summer blockbuster, there's not that many effects in general. There's only around 40 CGI shots in the whole film, in contrast to the hundreds that one might find in the typical MCU entry, but there's not that many practical effects shots either. After the futuristic prologue, we're 30 minutes into the film before the T-1000 first shows off his liquid metal powers, in the form of absorbing a bunch of shotgun blasts, courtesy of these spring-loaded appliances produced by Stan Winston and his team, then healing from them courtesy of this CGI morphing shot. Then he doesn't use his powers again until the end of the chase scene 8 minutes later in what I believe is the second CGI shot in the film. 5 minutes later, we get another demonstration with this practical makeup gag, followed by a CGI morphing shot demonstrating both the robot's ability to mimic other people and the lethal application of its powers. Then it's another 10 minutes before we get a CGI shot when he morphs into this guard, followed by another practical blade gag. He changes back into Robert Patrick with a camera pan instead of an effect. Then a whole 10 minutes after the last effect shot, we get him morphing through the bars of the asylum, which leads into a chase scene where there's a few more CG morphing shots, an animatronic head, more spring-loaded bullet hits, a couple of prosthetic hand blade appliances, and this impressive shot of chrome Robert Patrick running through the parking garage. Then it's almost an hour before the T-1000 shows back up at Cyberdyne for the climax. There's lots of really cool effects in this movie used to bring the T-1000 to life, both practical and digital, but I think the really impressive thing is how threatening the new Terminator is, not based on what he's necessarily doing on screen, but what we know he's capable of doing. The T-1000's morphing, the flagship effect and one of the main selling points of the film, is used in a careful, calculated, and restrained way, keeping it hidden until well into the movie, establishing its potential threat briefly to ramp up the tension, then letting the audience stew in their imaginations as Robert Patrick stalks around. Every one of these few effect shots is carefully planned and placed for the maximum storytelling impact, and part of the reason for that is that they had to be. Both the fledgling CGI and the state-of-the-art makeup and animatronic effects had to be planned and prepared months in advance of production, which means the filmmakers needed to know what they wanted going in. The action scenes in T2 were extensively storyboarded because the T-1000's effects needed to be specifically prepared, not just for specific shots, but for specific angles and lighting setups. Drawings, designs, and models were approved and locked in ahead of time. A sequence like this needed to be specifically written, developed, storyboarded, and planned well before production arrived on set, given that the effects elements, both CG and practical, could not be altered on the fly. If the studio decided that they wanted it to look different, they couldn't just have the CG artist create a different animation. They would have to resculpt, recast, repaint, and reprogram, then bear the incredible expense of going back to set to reshoot. And if they decided they didn't like the steel mill location, cutting the actors out and plopping them onto a cliff in Norway was not an option. I had the opportunity to shoot on film in film school, and while I would be way too financially stressed to ever use it for a large project, the experience did genuinely alter my approach to shooting and editing. It's not that film has some magical, ethereal quality that digital sensors can't replicate. There are plenty of movies that were shot digitally that I thought were shot on film, and there have been several movies shot on film whose sharp, noiseless cinematography I mistook for digital. Now, granted, I don't know shit about shit, but I would argue that the real value of analog filmmaking is the way it forces decision-making. Shooting on a vintage Bolex in film school, I had only a tiny viewfinder that told me nothing about how my exposure settings were affecting the final image. I had to just trust my tape measure and light meter and wait a week for the film to come back from the lab, hoping it wouldn't be under or overexposed. And that meant I couldn't just mess with the camera settings and find a cool shot on the day. I had to know what I wanted things to look like going in, do the math, meter the light, set the exposure, and pull the proverbial trigger. Editing the resulting footage on a Steenbeck also took finagling out of the equation. In Final Cut, I was used to adding and removing singular frames, going back and forth on when to cut until things looked perfectly smooth and polished, but literally cutting and splicing film with a razor blade and tape did not afford such a luxury, which meant my cuts had to be deliberate. The cost, inconvenience, low dynamic range, and general inflexibility of film requires one to approach it with a deliberate, carefully planned out vision and follow through on its execution until the end. The real benefit of analog filmmaking outside of grain, halation, and nostalgia is that it's a bitch and a half to work with, and that difficulty filters out a lot of fucking around and rewards coordination and assuredness. Obviously, this approach can be carried over into digital filmmaking, and I often pretend I am running film through an editing machine when cutting these videos together. But the freedom and finesse provided by digital filmmaking tools can more often than not lead to a lack of clear vision and indecisiveness. Of course, studios have always chased trends and tried to bend their products to audience whims. Pickup days after production wraps have always been a normal and planned-for part of the majority of film shoots, and test audiences, focus groups, and reshoots are nothing new. Star Wars was heavily re-edited after a disastrous informal test screening. 1960's Spartacus went through extensive reshoots. A lot of my favorite noir pictures, like 1946's Gilda, began production with unfinished screenplays. And all the way back in 1924, F.W. Murnau's The Last Laugh was given an improbably happy ending at the insistence of the studio. Terminator 2 itself had its original epilogue removed after test audiences complained that it didn't match the tone of the rest of the movie. Also, people talk about the improbability of Bucky Barnes becoming a senator, but how the fuck did John Connor become a senator? He has such an extensive criminal record, and his mom is a domestic terrorist. What happened here? But these were exceptions to the rule, and their mid-production course corrections were usually the result of unforeseen problems, not a deliberate backloading of creative decision-making. Thanks to digital tools, films can now begin production not only with unfinished scripts, but unbuilt sets, unscouted locations, and even undesigned wardrobe, with the plan to figure everything out in post and extensive reshoots being the chosen course from the beginning. And while studios have always tried to have their finger on society's pulse, the existence of social media allows them access to real-time reactions to production updates, trailers, and past films at a never-before-seen rate. And the public's whims often change faster than the length of the average film production schedule. New blockbusters don't even make it to the test screening phase. Courses are being corrected based on YouTube comments and Twitter posts. Not all of these changes are the direct result of digital filmmaking tools, but I would argue that the way the filmmaking pipeline has been altered to move decision-making into post-production has contributed to this overall culture of indecision. Course corrections are not always bad. Rogue One, for example, is probably the best of the new slate of Star Wars movies, and it went through extensive rewrites, reshoots, and a change in directors. But I would argue that they damage the overall quality of a film more often than they boost it. Suicide Squad went through a massive re-edit to match an upbeat, colorful trailer that received positive reactions, resulting in a confusing and disjointed final product. A lot of people didn't like The Last Jedi, so Disney completely altered course for the next movie, resulting in The Rise of Skywalker, which no one liked. Marvel saw the negative reactions to their version of Taskmaster and decided to unceremoniously kill her off in the first act of Thunderbolts, a move that even her biggest detractors found callous and tonally mismatched. Justice League had large sections reshot and had its tone shifted 180 degrees mid-production based on negative reactions to the dour tone of Batman v Superman, resulting in a film that alienated fans of the Snyderverse but left its critics dissatisfied with the lukewarm and tonally confusing final product. Justice League is an interesting case that allows us to see both the studio cut and the director's original vision. I am not a fan of Zack Snyder's filmmaking or his weird Ayn Randian approach to the DC universe, but for what it is, the Snyder Cut is by all measures a better movie. I would much rather watch the assured, uncompromised vision of a director I don't like than watch an indecisive film that bends itself out of shape to cater to my complaints. I agree with all the criticisms that the Whedon cut was correcting for, but trying to change gears mid-production to give people what they want rarely results in a good movie. So that brings us back to James Cameron. Avatar is a movie that has had a really interesting evolution in the cultural zeitgeist. It was a genuine groundbreaking worldwide phenomenon, an original movie that shattered box office records, kickstarted a new renaissance of 3D movies, and caused people to go through genuine addictive withdrawal. And then, as quickly as it took over the world, it became a joke. Jokes about how it had no cultural staying power, about how forgettable the plot and characters were, and about how the planned sequels were probably never coming out. As an aside, I actually have a theory about this. I first saw Avatar in theaters in 2009 and was blown away like everyone else. Then years later I saw it on a TV in Costco and was struck by how dated and boring it looked, and wondered how anyone had been impressed by it. Years after that, when I was in film school, I had the opportunity to watch it again in a theater in 3D and was again genuinely blown away. One of Avatar's greatest achievements is also one of its greatest pitfalls. Its status as a 3D movie is essential to its storytelling. Other 3D movies either use stereoscopy as a gimmick, with these films essentially acting as feature-length magic tricks, or tacked it on as a ticket price inflating extra, adding little to the experience but leaving the movie largely intact without it. Avatar, on the other hand, took the 3D technology seriously as a storytelling tool, integrating it in the same way that previous groundbreaking films integrated sound or color. While synchronized sound or color film were initially used as gaudy gimmicks, it wasn't until filmmakers more subtly integrated them as essential storytelling tools that they really caught on. And it was Avatar's subtle, story-focused use of 3D that demonstrated the cinematic potential of a technology previously relegated to cheap gimmicks and cash grabs. However, color and sound were universally adopted into the cinematic lexicon before a very important development:
Wizard of Oz on video cassette.
The rise of cheap, accessible home video. When VHS tapes and later DVDs, Blu-rays, and streaming services became a thing, sound and color had already been a universally adopted dimension of movies for decades, so it was a given that all home video formats would be in color and have sound. However, the 3D boom of the early 2010s came after the format of home video was already firmly established. While 3D TVs existed, they were rare, expensive, and not very good. And as people started to have more and more screens in their lives, the idea of a movie not being compatible with all of them became less and less attractive. Most people's experience with Avatar and home video was therefore underwhelming, and I think people, like me, assumed that the movie had simply become dated, or that their excitement in the theater had been some kind of worldwide mass hysteria, not accounting for the fact that a 2D version of the film is missing an essential storytelling element. Imagine if the only available home video release of, say, Terminator 2 had been in black and white and had intertitles instead of an audio track. You'd be wondering why you'd made such a fuss about this watchable but ultimately underwhelming and hard-to-follow film in theaters. Right now, I'm talking to you about how a 3D movie integrated 3D technology, and I can't show you any examples because you're watching this in a medium that is not 3D compatible. When the release date for Avatar 2 was finally announced, the big joke on the internet was that this was a movie that no one had asked for. There was no excitement for another Avatar movie. It had been over a decade, the hype had died down years ago, and even when there was hype, no one was really begging for a sequel. Everyone had assumed that the planned Avatar franchise would go the way of the Dark Universe and the Aunt May spy movie and all the other overly ambitious franchise announcements of the 2010s. And yet, in spite of the lack of demand, a decade-long gap, and almost zero online enthusiasm, Avatar: Way of the Water came out anyway. And, yeah. Avatar 2 might seem like a weird movie to be talking about in a video about the problems caused by digital filmmaking tools, given you know everything about it. But its gorgeous CGI is the result of nearly a decade of careful, precise planning. This is an example of a Hollywood filmmaker having a very distinct original vision from the get-go and following through on it, despite there being no demand for him to do so. This is not my favorite movie ever, and there's definitely a lot of issues I have with it, but it looks the way it does and is the way it is, not because of market research or a focus group or because some studio executive saw a meme about the last movie and decided to course correct, but because this is what James Cameron wanted. And in a cinematic landscape that is increasingly focused on trying to give fickle audiences exactly what they want, it was genuinely refreshing to see an incredibly successful movie get made that, as many have pointed out, nobody asked for. This is not my most focused video essay. It's kind of a Frankenstein amalgam of 3 different essay ideas that were too short on their own to constitute a whole video. Did you notice? Hopefully not. If you enjoyed it anyway, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you so much to my Patreon patrons, Sliwa and Stuffed Chicken, who picked this essay topic. For just $1, you can see these videos a week early, and for $5, you can vote on new topics, see behind-the-scenes tidbits, and be thanked at the end. Most importantly, it supports me making more videos like this more frequently, so if you like watching them, it's a great way to keep doing that. The link to my Patreon is in the description. If you don't like watching them, then I guess you can send a box of bees to my house. I live at 555 Grenadine Terrace, Uppsala, Michigan.